second. Before the ceremony began, Margaret told me that she has served the ASC for 41 years. She said 41 years ago, when she was at the meetings, there were 250 people in attendance. She said she knew that because she was the one collecting dues. She has held every major office we have in the association, from executive board to vice president to president, and she has served on every committee in the ASC, so she truly has done it all. In addition, she has served the discipline through her work for the National Institute of Justice as Director of the Violence and Victimization Division, as Acting Deputy Director of the Office of Research and Evaluation, and as Director of the Girls Study Group, and I had the privilege of working with her there. In the words of the award committee, Professor Zane's career is remarkable in its breadth as well as the length of service, and she has contributed to important institutional changes. So again, congratulations. Next is the August Vollmer Award, which recognizes a criminologist whose research has contributed to justice or to the treatment or prevention of criminal or delinquent behavior. And the recipient this year is Mark W. Lipsky from Vanderbilt University. To quote the awards committee, over the past 2 decades, Dr. Mark Lipsky's meticulous use of the technology of meta-analysis has changed the face of correctional policy. Beginning in the 1990s, Dr. Lipsky countered the widespread assumption that criminals could not be rehabilitated with rigorous and thorough reviews of over 400 controlled treatment evaluations. In more recent years, Dr. Lipsky has continued this line of inquiry to identify the characteristics of effective programming. Scholarship has had a transformative impact on the correctional enterprise, both within academia and the field of correctional practice. With the rise of evidence-based policy approaches, the ability to use the studies to show that treatment works has been instrumental in justifying the allocation of resources to offender reform. So again, congratulations. Next, turn to the Thorsten Selin and Sheldon Eleanor Gluck Award, and it is given in order to call attention to criminological scholarship that considers the problems of crime and justice as they are manifested outside the United States, internationally or comparatively. And the recipient this year is Clifford Shearing, the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Dr. Shearing's work is focused on policing and security, particularly the development of theoretical understandings that can be used to enhance the quality of security and justice governance. The Selin-Gwick Award Committee is particularly impressed with the important contributions Shearing has made to policy development for security strategies in South Africa, Northern Ireland, Jamaica, and Canada, and with his ability to combine this policy work with theoretical innovation and a prolific record of publication. He's the author or co-author of a dozen books and over 100 journal articles and chapters. So again, congratulations. Finally, we turn to the Edwin H. Sutherland Award and Address. The Sutherland Award recognizes outstanding contributions to theory of research and criminology on the etiology of criminal and deviant behavior, the criminal justice system, corrections, law, or justice. The recipient this year is Kathy Spatz-Winham, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Stand with me for a second. Sure. Professor Whittam is internationally renowned for her scholarship on child abuse and neglect and its consequences. She has published more than 130 articles and chapters on the topic and has received numerous awards and grants for her research. She's a fellow of the American Society of Criminology, the American Psychopathological Association, and the American Psychological Association, and she will next give the Sutherland Award address on varieties of violent behavior. So I will turn it over to you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I must say a couple of words to thank the people who nominated me and persisted in nominating me, the group that wrote the letter, the large number of people who signed the letter, my former students, my former postdocs, and my colleagues. I am really humbled and appreciate this award. So when Bob Agnew called to tell me that I had received the Sutherland Award, I was, wow, this is really wonderful. And then the reality set in, which was, uh-oh, I have to give an address. So I thought about, many of you know my work on the cycle of violence, and I thought I'd like to try to do something a little different and perhaps be a little provocative in this address. So we have an interesting situation. My computer is not hooked up to these, the presentation. So I'm going to try to maybe I will just forget that. Okay. So for those of you who talk at a podium, you know that it's nice to have either something in front of you or at least a monitor that is someplace other than over there, unless you're going to walk over there, because you're constantly sort of looking that way. So the title of my talk is Varieties of Violent Behavior. I've been thinking for a long time about the role of child abuse and neglect in violence, and have published many articles looking at how violence is one of the consequences of child abuse and neglect. But I have also been concerned about what role it really plays, and whether we're talking about correlates, whether we're talking about consequences, or whether, as some of you have suggested, child maltreatment may be a marker for other things. What I then began to think about is whether there are varieties of violent behavior, and whether we might learn something about violence and about the role of child abuse and neglect if we were to undertake this exercise. So that's what I did. I began following, following in a tradition of our esteemed colleagues, James Q. Wilson, who, as I'm sure all of you know, wrote the important book about varieties of police behavior. So we have a history of trying to unpack varieties, and you may also know that Marcia and Jan Chaikin did research for the Rand Foundation in the early 80s, where they looked at varieties of criminal behavior. So this is where I start. I start with the observation that there is an explicit or an implicit assumption in the field of criminology that violence is a homogeneous construct. We have theories of violence. We also have people who look at whether one can predict who becomes violent. We have scholars who look at the question of specialization and large debates about people specialize in violence, or is only violence part of what they do. We also have some skeptics. John Laub and Janet Luritzen in 1993 said, are there universal patterns of violent behavior? Karlstad and Eisner in 2003 said, is a general theory of violence possible? And McGargy, a psychologist in 1970, said instead of attempting to predict violence, I can't even read it. Is if it was a unitary, homogeneous mode of behavior, efforts should be directed at differentiating meaningful subtypes or syndromes. I would argue that we have not pursued those skeptical concerns or asked, is there meaningful heterogeneity among violent offenders? And so I'm going to look at that question. So the outline of this talk is I'm going to give you a very brief rationale for considering varieties of violent behavior. And that would be great. Thanks very much. Two-handed. Okay. Is it on? Can you hear me? Great. This is going to be published as an article in Criminology, and there will be theory, but I'm not talking about theories. So pardon me, excuse me, for sort of just jumping ahead with this examination. So I'm going to give you a brief rationale for considering varieties of violent behavior. I'm going to identify 4 types of violent offenders. I'm going to use data from my longitudinal study called Development Through the Life Cycle to examine these types, and then I'm going to discuss relevance for research and policy. So just as a reminder, what we mean when we talk about the cycle of violence, at least what I mean when I talk about the cycle of violence, is the hypothesis that violence or physical abuse in childhood leads to the perpetration of violence subsequently in adolescence, in adulthood. And there are now several major prospective longitudinal studies. Oh, that's really, sorry, the slide is screwed up. That triangle should be up. Can you do that? You can't. Forget it. Anyway, the slide shows the location of the studies that have looked at this question of the cycle of violence across the United States. Different geographic regions, time periods, youth, sex, and ages, definitions of child maltreatment and assessment. And I argue that the replications across these studies with all these different characteristics increases the generalizability of the results and gives us confidence in this notion of a cycle of violence. So in the late 1980s, I focused on the cycle of violence. Since that time, child abuse and neglect has played a major role, a prominent role in research on violent offending. But violence occurs without child abuse and neglect. For example, there is no indication that the perpetrators in the school shootings that have happened across the country have histories of abuse and neglect. Violence also occurs in conjunction with post-traumatic stress disorder. So we know that there is PTSD in mentally ill inmates who are violent. We know that there are a lot of people interested in the extent of PTSD associated with combat exposure among military veterans, and serious questions about the extent to which those experiences of exposure to combat have led to, and the PTSD have led to subsequent violence when these folks come back. And there's a literature on PTSD in battered women who become violent and murder spouses. So for those of you who don't know what post-traumatic stress disorder is, just a quickie, PTSD develops after a major traumatic event involving physical harm or threat of physical harm. Normally, a person's fight or flight response protects a person from harm. But what happens in the case of PTSD is that even in situations where there isn't that immediate threat, these individuals still feel stressed, frightened, without this immediate danger. And the symptoms include re-experiencing, flashbacks, bad dreams, avoiding these places, losing interest, and hyperarousal, so easily startled, feeling on edge, angry outbursts. Some of you might see some analogy to reactive aggression. So we have three constructs that we're talking about: child abuse and neglect, PTSD, and violence. And how are they related? Well, in some ways, the research works in separate silos, but we know that child abuse and neglect predicts aggression, delinquency, and violence. We know that child abuse and neglect predicts PTSD. But we also know, importantly, that these relationships are not linear in terms of development or deterministic. So is violence a product of these earlier experiences, or is it a function of individual characteristics? So I'm going to just quickly describe, this is the study that I've been involved in for many years. This is a chronology of the study. And I put this up because the data that I'm going to be talking about to illustrate types of violent behavior come from this study. So I began with court-substantiated cases of abuse and neglect from the years 1967 to 71 and a matched control group. And we first collected arrest records in 87 to 89. And then did a national death index search because if these folks were dead, then they shouldn't be continuing to offend, although we know that records are problematic. So there were some who were offending even though they were no longer with us. And it was at that time that we said, so that was an archival study. But from that time on, we then tried to find these individuals 22 years after their early childhood experiences, and we've been following them ever since. So what you can see is we did our first in-person interviews when they were 29. We did another arrest record search. We did an interview when they were approximately 40, focusing on re-victimization. We did a medical exam and interview with these folks at age 41. And more recently, we've just finished a large study of the intergenerational transmission of neglect and abuse, looking at these folks that we've been studying and a subset of their offspring. So I'm going to be talking about data from many of these waves. So just to remind you, these are the findings from Maxfield and Whittam, which was based on the second set of data. And what you can see is that The highest percent who has an arrest for violence are the physically abused kids, which is the cycle of violence. But we also have very high rates, indistinguishable, among the neglected kids, and low for multiple types, low for sexual abuse, and low for controls. This is PTSD, and I just put it up to illustrate, since we're going to be talking about PTSD, that you see a different pattern. These are lifetime diagnoses at age 29. You see that it's the sexual abuse group who has the highest rate of PTSD. The physical and neglect are lower, and the multiple is higher, whereas it was lower in terms of violence. So now I'm going to talk about possible varieties. So I said we already know that there's a group of people who were abused in childhood and become violent. Is there a group of people who are just violent without a history of child abuse and neglect? So that's the first group. So I took all the violent offenders in my sample, and probably the bad news, not maybe the good news for research, but the bad news for them is that we have a large number of violent offenders. These are violence based on arrest data. So we have a group of people who don't have a history of abuse and neglect. We have a group of people who have a history of abuse and neglect who became violent, but we have two other groups. We have a group of people who first developed PTSD, and we have this temporally correct, and then became violent. And we have another group of people who first became violent and then developed PTSD. So I'm going to be talking about these four groups, and just for comparison purposes, to sort of ground this, I'm going to look at the people who have no child abuse and neglect, no violence, and no PTSD. And this may come as a surprise to you, because it came as a surprise to me that almost half of these violent offenders in the blue don't have a history of child abuse and neglect. And the other half have a history of child abuse and neglect, and almost a third are in this child abuse to violent group, but about 21% also have PTSD. So the green group are the people who have PTSD first, and the red group are the people who have violence and then develop PTSD. So these are the four groups that we're going to be looking at to see whether there's any meaningful information looking at these heterogeneous, or are they heterogeneous groups? So starting simply, we're looking at arrests here, and the pattern of the slides is going to be the same throughout. So what you can see is here are the people who have the none, that's the none group. So they do have some arrests, but obviously they don't have any violent arrests. And what you can see is that the child abuse and neglect to violence group has the highest mean number of arrests, as does the violence group. And here, it's the child abuse and neglect group and the violence first group that have the highest mean number of arrests for violence. Oops. If we look at the types of violent offenses, we see that the violent-only group has the highest rate of assaults. The violence first group has the highest rate of battery and rape sodomy, and the PTSD group, PTSD first group, has the highest percent of murder or manslaughter. So clear differences in these patterns, and what I think is interesting is that with the exception of assault, the violence-only group has not the highest rate of these particular violent offenses. There's a lot of debate in the criminology literature about reliance on arrests and problems with arrests. So the good thing is we also have self-reports. And so what you can see here is, here's the none group. Here's the violence-only group. But what you can see is that the violence-first group has the highest mean number of reports. This is the conflict tactics scale. So this is within family violence. So it's the highest here, it's the highest here, it's the highest here in terms of very severe violence. And this is more a general criminal violence, but still self-report. And here, the PTSD first group has higher. Interestingly, the child abuse to violence group, that sort of mustard color group, is much lower than those two PTSD groups. If we look now at family characteristics, which is one of the things that people consider to be predictors of violence, you can see that violence first group has the highest percent of parents on welfare, parent arrested, siblings arrested. 100% of their siblings were arrested. Here they have a slightly lower rate of mother having an alcohol problem, but father having an alcohol problem is very, very high. And this is a measure of whether they lived with their parents until age 18, and what you can see is that the two PTSD groups were least likely to live with their parents. And I think it's instructive then also to look at the violence-only group, which is, has many fewer parents on welfare, fewer parents arrested, and basically in between on here, very similar to the violence, to the none group, very similar to the none group. IQ, education, marriage, and employment. We've learned a lot from John Laub and Rob Sampson and others about the importance of particularly marriage and employment in terms of bonds to society and risk for criminal behavior. And what you can see here, again, is, so these are IQ scores, standardized scores, and you can see that here are the people with none, no violence, no child abuse and neglect, no PTSD, and it goes down. So this group has the highest, the lowest IQ. The violence first group has the least likely percent to graduate from college, to be employed. Major differences between the groups, and to be married. And it's interesting that again, here's this violence-only group, which looks relatively good compared to these child abuse and neglect groups. We look at traumas and victimization, given that one group has developed PTSD, and what you can see here is that it's not surprising that it is the PTSD first group who had PTSD and then became violent, who has, so highest physical assault, not highest, highest family or friend murdered or suicide, witnessing violence, and crime victimization. So here's the green group, the green group, the green group, the green group, the green group here. Here are the people with none, the violence only, the child abuse group. And in this case now, the people who had violence first have fewer traumas and victimization experiences in their background. So a lot of you have worried about, these are court-substantiated cases, and we always get a question about, well, what about the undetected, unreported child abuse and neglect? So what you can see here is that, and I should say my husband was really surprised at these rates, but so this is the none group. So the people who don't have child abuse and neglect, don't have PTSD, and don't have violence are saying that they were a victim of physical abuse in childhood. But I think this is what we find when we ask people about their histories. Here's the violence-only group, so actually a lower rate than the people who are not violent. And then you have the child abuse and neglect to violence group, and then the two PTSD groups who have the highest reports of saying that they were abused. And the picture for sexual abuse is pretty similar, and the picture for neglect. So I think this fits with at least this categorization of these three groups clearly, both in terms of their official reports and self-reports, higher rates of abuse and neglect. Psychiatric diagnoses at age 29. What you can see is these are considered to be internalizing disorders, so depression, dysthymia, and generalized anxiety. Alcohol, drugs, and antisocial personality are considered to be externalizing. And so you can see that the PTSD first group is higher in terms of the internalizing, and the violence first group is higher in terms of the externalizing. And we see the same pattern at age 40. So here's the Beck anxiety disorder measure, depression and dissociation. So the same, here's that PTSD first group, here's the violence group, and here's that, this is the violence first group. But here is, again, the violence-only people. So they're engaging in violence, but I would suggest they look similar to the none group. So this is just to sort of summarize what I would suggest to you is a pattern of characteristics. So as you look across the row, you can see that there is generally an increase in the negative consequences or the negative characteristics. So the first one is having a parent who is arrested. The second one is having a sibling arrested. The next one is being homeless, having a period of homelessness. This is the mean number of physical traumas, sexual traumas, and I call your attention to, this is the violence first group. For those of you who are psychopathy checklist devotees, you will note that the violence first group has the highest psychopathy checklist scores, but it follows this very interesting pattern. This is the number of violent arrests. This is the percent who are deficient on a reading ability measure at age 29. So if you look, here are the people who are not abused and neglected. Here are the violent-only people. These are the child abuse and neglect to violence, and then the two PTSD group. And these are, you've seen these before, the IQ, the highest grade of school, but this is the age of onset for first arrest, and you can see that this violence first group has very early age of onset, as does the child abuse and neglect. So for, I would argue, varieties of violent behavior, what are the distinguishing characteristics? The violence-only group. So almost half of the offenders are in this group, but they don't seem to have any distinguishing features. The only distinguishing feature is that they are almost exclusively male. They lived with natural mom and dad, 39% of them until 18. They had low rates of mother alcohol, and the age at first arrest was similar to the no violence group. The child abuse and neglect to violence group had an early age at first arrest, highest mean number of violent arrests, early onset of drug use, a high number of physical traumas, but no PTSD. And they really fall in the middle, not the worst, not the best. The child abuse and neglect to PTSD to violence, that is the PTSD first group, that is, they developed PTSD and then they became violent, had the highest number of traumas, physical assault, family friend murdered, etc., and crime victimization, highest number of childhood traumas, highest rates of internalizing disorder at 29, at age 40, anxiety, depression, and fewer arrests for violence, similar to the violent-only group, and a high percent of females. And then this group, child abuse and neglect, the violence first group, who engaged in a lot of violence and then developed PTSD. So they had early age of onset for any arrest, a violent arrest, and drugs, large number of arrests for violence, self-reports of violence, and serious violence. Actually, lower rates of traumas and victimization experiences except for sexual assault, but the worst family background, least likely to live with mother and father, and high rates of externalizing disorders. So what do I conclude from this? I would suggest that the assumption of homogeneity in violent behaviors is not warranted. That we need to acknowledge that there are different developmental patterns of violent offenders. And there is this large group of violent offenders who is most similar to the none group. And I think we need to ask, are our theories explaining these folks? Child abuse and neglect is present in the background of about half of the violent offenders. The PTSD group has high rates of prior victimization and internalizing, but minimal violence. And the violence first group shows early onset, worst violence, and extensive risk characteristics. So what is the relevance for research? I suggested that theories of violence need to explain that violence-only group, that certain criminological theories explicitly incorporate child abuse and neglect, like strain, but we need to acknowledge that there are different developmental patterns of violent behavior that I hope I have shown you here play out differently over time. The etiology of that violence first group is really synchronous with what we consider when we think about the subcultural violence. If you think back to those family characteristics. But is there any discussion of PTSD in that theory? Is the violence first group similar to what Temi Moffitt has talked about in terms of life course persistent offenders? Might we expect neurobiological deficits? And these are all researchable, answerable questions. And who are the people in the PTSD first group? Are they individuals who, for example, battered women who developed PTSD in the context of their relationships and then became violent, and they are represented then in those high rates of murder and manslaughter and lower rates of violent arrests in general. Implications for policy. That large group, half of these violent offenders, I would suggest has no obvious, unless you can maybe point it out to me, no obvious targets for intervention. So what should we do about them? They're a very destructive group and a large group. Violence prevention policies that target abused and neglected children are warranted, given the prominent role of child abuse and neglect in the backgrounds of violent offenders. And so the work that's currently being done targeting them should be encouraged, supported. But we also, I would suggest, need to attend to the role of PTSD because it's present in about 1/5 of violent offenders. But it's largely ignored. Criminological theories point to the role of social and structural causes of violence. These findings suggest the importance of early experiences and that interventions should target individuals and families at multiple levels. So I acknowledge my grant support with great appreciation to multiple funders, and I thank you for listening. Great.
I'd like to thank Kathy for a fascinating presentation, one with fundamental implications for criminology. I want to remind you that there's a reception next door. Go to your left as you exit, and in a short while, Ron Akers and the Bluegrass Band will be performing, but will the awards recipients again, please remain for a few minutes while we take some photos. So thank you so much, and that concludes this session.